We call cognitive psychology the study of the mind. But what is it we're studying? What is the mind? What does it do? By definition, the mind is that thing that creates representations of the world so that we can act within it to achieve our goals. The mind, though, has a lot of responsibilities. It is all of perception, attention, memory, emotion, impulse control, language, both understanding and communicating. It interprets symbols. It's also responsible for thinking, reasoning, decision-making. All of this is what we call cognition. The mind-body problem is a conflict that goes back to ancient Greece. Are the mind and the body two different things, as in Plato's dualism, or are they one and the same, as in Aristotle's materialism? How the mind and the body interacts is one of the problems that we're getting closer to solving, but we're not quite there yet. This argument starts as science in 1795, when astronomer Neville Maskelyne was keeping track of planets and stars as they crossed the horizon, and he had a line with a big telescope. And he couldn't man the telescope by himself all the time, so his assistant did some of the work for him. What he noticed was one of his assistants was half a second to 8/10 of a second all the time. And he yelled at his assistant, he hit his assistant, and it only got worse. So eventually he had to fire the bum, but not knowing that it was reaction time and processing speed that was the problem, not his just lack of effort. What he was observing, though he never did anything with it other than fire the guy, is that people have different reaction times, different processing speeds, around an average. Another astronomer, a second person to come across this in 1815, found that people who keep track of stars would actually make errors all the time. There wasn't a uniform consistency. He was fascinated by the differences, which later led to the study of physiology, but we're working on psychology and we're not even in medical science yet. Then there's the work of Luigi Galvani, who thought that neural impulses might be electrical, and his nephew, who continued his work by reanimating the severed heads of French criminals during the French Revolution, who were probably royal and nobility. You've got Franz Gall, who believed that the mind should be an organ. He didn't do well at predicting what organ it was, but he believed it was an organ, and that our mental life can be traced to physiology. Who we are is a manifestation of our chemistry and biology. He was removed for having anti-Christian ideas. In his day, if you were in one of the other countries other than Germany, you might actually get burned at the stake for this kind of thing. Germany was enlightened, as it were, because it broke away from the Catholic Church and was allowed to do this. Mueller wrote the first physiology handbook. Then you have a series of scientists, we'll call them. For example, people, Marshall Hall, Guido Florenz, who essentially cut animals' heads off and then watched their bodies run around and then watched as electrodes were attached to their body, what happened. Florenz specifically would destroy parts of the brain in animals and see what effect that had on the animal. You've got Paul Broca, who studied people with aphasia not being able to come up with words effectively, and over time made the generalization that they would have similar damage to a certain part of the brain, the part of the brain on the left side, just above the ear, that does language processing. Then we get to Hermann Helmholtz, who made a lot of discoveries. But one of his most famous was that the brain, the thinking, and the motor movement are not instantaneous like we thought they were. There's actually a time lag. And he would measure the speed of those neural impulses in frogs when they cut off the head and then activated the nerve that went into the body and see how long it took for that leg to jump. He noticed. Then you've got Ramon Cajal, who didn't publish in German, English, or French, so he didn't make it into any major journals, but he did do a lot of independent work. So why is this important in Germany? Well, Germany, you've got the Protestant church separating from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church really was against studying the body for power purposes. They would actually burn people at the stake for egregious dissection. They would tell people to stop, and then they... Germany, however, being Protestant and away from the power of the Pope, was more able to do research. However, the research here, it takes time to develop. It starts out as physiology, and psychology in per se takes a long time to develop, and they didn't even welcome it. Your first major psychologist, well, physiologist studying the psychology aspects, is a man named Fechner. He's responsible for a just noticeable difference, measuring things like how much of a difference does it take for you to feel in stimuli that there's a difference. October 21st is his day, and This is when cognitive psychologists get just noticeably drunk. Bad joke. It was a bad joke. Finally, we get to Wilhelm Wundt. He's called the father of psychology, even though he considered Fechner to be the father of psychology, with all the research that Fechner did, which is probably a more accurate relationship. But Wundt was the first one who opened a laboratory to study psychology, but again, it was more physiology. Functionalism isn't something that happened until William James. This was structuralism, the parts and pieces of the body and how they interact with the brain, how many frequencies of sound we hear or how many colors we see. But he takes Fechner's ideas on just noticeable difference and difference threshold. He makes a lot of discoveries. He publishes a bunch of, well, not him personally, but hundreds of graduate students. He went to Heidelberg and studied under Helmholtz and quit and hated it. A lot of people tried to study like other people and they just hated it and ran away. And they opened up their own lab. That's how things worked. Anyway, in 1876, he opened his laboratory to study physiology, psychology. In 1881, he tried to open his own journal, Philosophical Studies. He wanted psychological studies, but that was taken by people who were hunting ghosts at the time. And there was a lot of belief in ghosts back then. Wundt actually did try to study cognition and thinking and the invisible stuff, but he found that the mind had so many different directions and confounding variables that it was almost impossible to research just being himself and his graduate students and the technology of the time. What he did figure out, what he did come up with, was that people voluntarily acted. He believed in free will, as opposed to behaviorists at the time, which were more responsive and reaction, instinct essentially. Wundt actually believed that people were capable and often did exhibit free will in their decision making.